Jordan Daly and Sawyer Feller's National History Day project on the Yom Kippur War.
During the Yom Kippur War, there were three main leaders. The Prime Minister of Israel was Menachem Begin, the leader of Syria was Hafez al-Assad, and the leader of Egypt was Anwar Sadat. In Israel at 2 p.m. on October 6, 1973, they were attacked by Syria, led by Hafez al-Assad, and Egypt, led by Sadat. The Yom Kippur War was inherited by the result of the June 1967 Six-Day War. During the campaign, the Israel Defense Forces (IDF) not only humiliated the Arab armies but also seized large portions of Syrian, Jordanian, and Egyptian territory. Although possessions of the Golan Heights and the Sinai Peninsula gave Israel much-needed strategic depth, this war was absolutely intolerable to highly nationalistic regimes in Damascus and Cairo. Israel's continued occupation for these lands transformed the abstract grievances of Palestinian rights into a deeply resented insult of the Arab governments and armies involved. The Yom Kippur War was also known as the War of Atonement, or for the Muslims, the Ramadan War, because it began during the holy month of Ramadan. The conflict of the Yom Kippur War led to a compromise between Israel and Egypt, which will culminate in the 1979 peace agreement between Egypt's President Anwar Sadat and Israel's Prime Minister Menachem Begin. This is Abba Ibn, and he's going to talk about the Yom Kippur War.
I rejoice to notice that in all my talks with representatives of governments and of the press and other communications media, I haven't met anybody who takes seriously anything except the certain knowledge that this was a brutal and unprovoked attack in great mass by Egypt and Syria across the ceasefire lines on the 6th of October. That then is how it began. We reject two things which are sometimes invoked to explain or to excuse this massive recourse to military force. It is sometimes said, for example, that the Arab states had no other alternative. In the light of their obvious policy of changing the previous ceasefire lines, they had no alternative except recourse to war. And the second absurdity is that this is a war which has some special reference to the territories that have been in Israel's administration since 1967. Anybody who believes either of these things completely misunderstands the nature of the drama that now unfolds before us.
On Yom Kippur, 90,000 Egyptian soldiers and 850 tanks crossed the Suez Canal. They destroyed the 300 Israeli tanks. At the same time, 500 Syrian tanks overwhelmed Israeli forces on the Golan Heights. The only way the Israeli army could survive this was because of an airlift from the USA. This was thousands of tons of advanced weaponry shortly after the USSR sent arms to Syria and Egypt. When Israeli crossed the Suez Canal and were 50 miles from Cairo, the Egyptian capital, the USA and USSR sponsored a joint UN resolution calling for immediate ceasefire and negotiations for a peace settlement. It was supposed to happen on October 22nd, but it broke down. The superpowers came close to a direct clash over the Middle East. Egyptians requested U.S. and Soviet troops be sent to enforce ceasefire. The Soviets threatened to respond immediately to counter the Israeli threat to the Egyptian capital. The U.S. government was alarmed by the threat of armed intervention by Soviet troops. For a time, U.S. forces were put on nuclear alert. However, both superpowers were keen to avoid a direct confrontation. In the event, Soviets backed down and agreed to the formation of a UN emergency force. The fighting ended on October 24th, and a few days later, UN troops were sent to Egypt to enforce the ceasefire.
Less than 2 years earlier, an unprecedented move for Arab leader Sadat traveled to Jerusalem, Israel, to seek a permanent peace settlement with Egypt's Jewish neighbor after decades of conflict. Sadat's visit, in which he met with Begin and spoke before Israel's parliament, was met with outrage in most of the Arab world. Despite criticism from Egypt's regional allies, Sadat continued to persuade peace with Begin. In September 1978, the two leaders met again in the United States, where they negotiated a peace agreement with U.S. President Jimmy Carter at Camp David, Maryland. The Camp David Accords, the first peace agreement between the State of Israel and one of its Arab neighbors, laid groundwork for diplomatic and commercial relations. 7 months later, a formal peace treaty was signed. For their achievements, Sadat and Begin were jointly awarded the 1978 Nobel Prize for Peace. Sadat's peace efforts were not so highly acclaimed, and Arab world Egypt was suspended from the Arab League, and on October 6, 1981, Muslim extremists assassinated Sadat in Cairo. Nevertheless, the peace proceeded without Sadat. In 1982, Egypt formally established diplomatic relations with Israel. The October War was, in the end, a military victory for the Israelis. Yet again, they have proved their weapons, training, and tactics were superior. When the war ended, Israeli forces were only 50 miles from Cairo and 20 miles from the Syrian capital, Damascus. But they had incurred far more losses of both men and weaponry than in previous wars. Perhaps most significant, the Arabs had destroyed the myth of Israeli invincibility. They had completely surprised the Israelites and the rest of the world with their attack. They had provided that Arab soldiers could fight with courage and determination under skilled leaders. They had overcome the humiliation of the Six-Day War and restored Arab pride, honor, and self-confidence. They had acted together, both their military planning and use of oil weapon. As a result, the rest of the world showed much more respect for Arabs. Sadat achieved exactly what he planned to do. First, he had broken the stalemate that existed before the war. Secondly, he had forced a change in U.S. policy. From now on, the U.S. was far more friendly towards the Arab states, keen to establish and cement its position as a dominant superpower in the Middle East, and far more to persuade Israel to enter peace negotiations. For Syria, the Yom Kippur War was a disaster. The unexpected Egyptian-Israeli ceasefire exposed Syria to a military defeat. Israel seized more territory in the Golan Heights. In 1979, Syria voted with the other Arab states to expel Egypt from the Arab League. In 1979, Egypt and Israel, after having fought 4 wars since 1948, concluded with a formal peace treaty. It was signed by Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, and witnessed by President Jimmy Carter at a ceremony on the South Lawn of the White House.
Thank you for watching our presentation on the Yom Kippur War.